Hello, I'm Kendall Taylor-Wright, she, her, hers. I'm an equity peer leader for the Center for Multicultural Engagement and Inclusion at Metropolitan State University of Denver. This event, Students Strong, will be dedicated to student activists, campus resource awareness, community-involved stories, current and future activism, and more. On today's agenda, I will be reading a land acknowledgement and BIPOC statement. We will review event norms. I'll do a brief trigger warning, a presentation, discussion prompts, and end with some final thoughts. I will now read a slightly abridged land acknowledgement. This acknowledgement is an excerpt from the MSU Denver Office of Diversity and Inclusion. Today, we honor and acknowledge that we are in traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne and Arapaho nations. This area was also the site of trade, hunting, gathering, and healing for many other Native nations. We recognize the indigenous peoples as the original stewards of the land. Let us also acknowledge the painful history of genocide and forced removal from this territory. We respect the many diverse indigenous peoples still connected to this land on which we gather. We pay our respects to them by giving thanks through our continued advocacy for all tribal nations and the ancestors of this place. I have written a BIPOC statement, and it is as follows. CMEI acknowledges the BIPOC community through allyship, action, and cultural competency. We acknowledge ongoing systematic oppression, socioeconomic disparities, and racial injustices that are experienced by our community every day. We embody allyship aimed at disrupting these oppressive systems through action, support, education, and the creation of space for BIPOC leaders and voices. Thank you for your continued allyship. Let's discuss event norms and best practices for this discussion. First, we commit to confidentiality. What's learned here leaves here. What's shared here stays here. Let's help to create a brave space where people can honestly engage. Next, our primary commitment is to learn from one another. We will listen to each other and not talk at each other to prepare us to help raise awareness and understanding of differences and similarities through this process. The big one, accept, a lack of closure. This is the start of a conversation, one that I hope leaves us with lingering questions and thoughts. Please monitor your airtime. Be mindful you're taking up space from others, but also note, please empower yourself to speak up if others are dominating the conversation. When we challenge the idea, not the person. We will not demean, devalue, or put down people for their experiences, lack of experiences, or difference in interpretation of those experiences. Finally, we will trust that people are doing the best they can and that we are all co-learners. We recognize that it is likely that we have learned misinformation about our group and members of other groups. We will hold ourselves and others responsible for repeating misinformation or offensive behavior after we've learned otherwise. Please note, this presentation has images depicting violence and distress. Your overall well-being is priority. Campuses have long been a haven for the intellectually curious and potentially radical. Some of the more famous student protests are known for violent reasons. As we quickly review the past, try to make a mental note of why and when protests became violent. What does that say about the effectiveness of student organized protests? And how might these historical events inspire you or increase hesitation? Tiananmen Square. The events leading up to this revolutionary moment were in part because of Western media, among so many other things. After an extended period of restriction, artists were being exposed to new ideas. Students were studying abroad through governmental assistance programs, and of course, knowledge is power. As an art history student, I must note that there were some wonderful art shows and progressive youth movements gathering at the square. And there was some wonderful art coming out of China in the 80s. In the spring of 1989, Chinese pro-democracy advocates filled Beijing's Tiananmen Square. For weeks, the protests, led by students, stood in defiance of the communist regime. Beyond that, it's important to frame the environment of one where information was being shared more freely after a long communist crackdown. In that way, it seems to prove the government's point, and they saw this freedom as a threat. The protesters called for respect for human rights and greater political participation amid the ambitious economic reforms. Protests eventually spread to 400 cities across China. Communist Party leaders, however, very much saw this as a threat to their power and political system. On the morning of June 4th, the government sent armed troops to dissolve the demonstration in Tiananmen Square, killing and arresting activists. Though there's no official death toll, estimates range from several hundred to more than 10,000. This day is thought to be one of the bloodiest political crackdowns in modern history. Another student-led protest, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, founded in 1960 in the wake of student-led sit-ins at segregated lunch counters across the South, and became a major channel for student participation during the civil rights movement. Please note there's a heavy emphasis and focus on being nonviolent in their actions. And so on February 1st, 1960, 4 students walked into a Woolworths with the intention of ordering lunch. 4 men from that first day quickly turned into 15 the next, then 300 by the end of the week, later 1,000. With the advisement of Ella Baker, she stressed the importance to maintain an independent and unaffiliated organization from the adult civil rights. Youth versus adult, just meaning providing more avenues for people to join organizations in the fight for justice. In South Africa, the Soweto Uprising was a series of demonstrations and protests led by Black school children in South Africa that began June 16, 1976. It is estimated that 20,000 students took part in the protests, and they were met with fierce police brutality. Many were shot and killed. There are many layers of tension that were building to the eruption of this uprising. This was a response to the introduction of Afrikaans as a medium of instruction in local schools. It is something to note that unlike indigenous African languages of the continent, Afrikaans is a Dutch-based South African language, not indigenous to the continent. In other words, the language of the colonizers. The police fired tear gas and live ammunition at students demonstrating. The official count is 176 protesters that were killed, but actual estimates are much higher. And now, June 16th is a public holiday in South Africa, Youth Day in remembrance. I would also like to bring attention to a modern example, and furthermore, a nonviolent example. We live in an age of social media, and along with there being plenty of negative effects, there is a power in social media, as we can see in a student who took to TikTok to share his story. The movement began October 27th, 2020, when a student named Mikel Gomez was expelled and referred to psychologists for wearing a skirt to school in Spain. The boy shared his now viral video on TikTok in November, explaining he wanted to show support for feminism and diversity. Since then, November 4th has become Wear a Skirt to School Day, while hundreds of students and teachers have joined in to show solidarity. Closing thoughts about student-organized protests. They don't always have to end in violence. There is an aspect of solidarity being the key component in all of these examples. Solidarity not only among students to bring these protests and to bring awareness to fruition, there's an institutional and community support that is equally imperative. It was the government responses to the student protests that made the change to violence. A modern protest can still have just as much power with social media as it creates amateur journalists and activists out of an average citizen. The roles of activism feel very narrow at times, but I would like to explore each aspect. Let's start with marches. We have to be aware and keep equity in mind, as this holds a certain level of physical privilege and has an air of ableism. How can we ensure the activity we are doing is inclusive? With physical protests, health may become a factor. And overall, this may not be the preferred way to express your DEI training or how you would like to express your activism. There shouldn't be an unnecessary pressure to involve yourself in marches and protests. Voting, another default to activism, how we can make change. There's a nationality privilege that's associated with that. And in doing so, we can also bring awareness to those who are disenfranchised. Being able to sign petitions to get more causes on the ballot allows for more diversity on our ballots so we can choose the best option for our communities and selves. Again, with politics, let's not think so literal with this. Yes, voting in the elections is great, as we mentioned with the point before, but also be aware that voting in local elections is just as important. If you have the time and resources, being a member of an HOA board or other committee. Find ways to insert yourselves in positions of power. No matter to what extreme of power that this has, these are ways that we can leverage our positions for change. When we're volunteering, please note, as wonderful it is to physically be there, sometimes volunteering our time in other ways is also best. When it comes to providing materials for folks, whether it be food or clothing, please go to the nonprofit website or reach out to them first. They usually have lists available online or lists available if you call. That will help you define and refine your list and how you'd like to utilize your resources for change. With monetary support, sometimes this can feel like a cop-out, or others may shame us into thinking it's a cop-out. But similar to marching, sometimes money is just the best way to utilize your resources and dispensing of them appropriately. Another way we can reframe how money can be quite powerful. CAN drives kind of grind my gears. This is because, unfortunately, this starts to devolve into a conversation of how are they going to cook it? How are they going to open up the can in some cases? And how are we humanizing the situation? At times, it is best to give money directly to food banks, as they usually have direct access to food distribution centers, usually also used by schools, prisons, restaurants, etc. With organization and networking, we all know people. As we have healthy conversations with folks, maybe your role within activism is linking friends up, connecting friends, sharing resources. Maybe the best way to utilize your skills is in an administrative role or accounting. Finally, solidarity. Sometimes it's the smallest action or a nonverbal action that let people know that they are in a safe space. So speaking up when necessary, combating our bystander effect, even wearing a color for a movement on a particular day, standing in silence with others, passing the microphone, or even something like staring at the loud couple getting into a fight so that everybody knows they're being watched and hopefully can decrease and de-escalate the conflict from a safe distance. Activism is just a way to leverage our privileges for the betterment of others. There should be no shame in what you can do to impact justice, self-awareness, cultural competency, and equity. I'd like to discuss some campus resources. Yes, this information is geared towards MSU Denver programs and students, but maybe on your campus you have similar programs. When we think about how to utilize these resources, we not only want to support ourselves, but how can this support our work or support others? Another way we can think about it is, how can we utilize the resource, whether it be a personal benefit or as a jumping off point to help you further organize your work? Sometimes the resources on campus are ways to find partnerships and connections along with personal assistance. We have the Student Care Center, where we have a food pantry, case managers, single stop, which is a way to access government benefits such as SNAP, Medicaid, WIC. There's also an emergency student fund that after an application process, money is available for those who qualify for emergency funds. EPIC scholars, uplifting those who have been in foster care system. The next department I'm going to talk about is my department, which is CMEI, where I work as an equity peer leader. We do have a lovely long list of different departments that we represent. A couple I'd like to highlight are ways to promote inclusion within your personal experiences. And that can be done through student organizations, identity cohorts, and equitable programming, like what we're offering here today with the equity peer leaders. Faculty can also be a great resource, as even if they don't have the answer that you're looking for, they might be a great way to connect you to the next of the health center, which in turn has the access center. If you have an apparent or non-apparent disability, the access center is a great way to ensure that you can complete all of your duties as a student. And with the apparent and non-apparent disabilities, in some cases, those are temporary, as some are chronic. And the counseling center. At MSU Denver, there are therapists available, and with an interview process, you're able to connect with a resource. When we think of our community, I'd like to dig a little bit deeper into, again, some of these quick associations when we think of activist work. Everyone always speaks of self-care. I do have a qualm with when people say things like drink water, version of self-care. We in fact need water to survive. When I refer to self-care, that's the additional ways that we can love ourselves. And that can be through doing your favorite hobby, to rest and relaxation, seeking mental assistance, the whole you can't pour from an empty cup. Getting to know yourself through trial and error is fantastic and can be scary at times. But with practice, you can learn to identify, enforce, and adapt your limits and boundaries. Friends and family can be a bit toxic at times, but they can also be a fantastic support system. Curate those that can support you in ways that you need. A buddy system, sourcing them for funds to donate to a nonprofit, or to provide a healthy distraction when you need. Hotlines can be a fantastic resource if money and time are an issue. Also, being able to speak to someone anonymously can provide a freedom for folks to be very honest with themselves. And finally, support groups. In the community sense, that can be found on campus within organizations that we're a part of in our classrooms, but you can seek them out online with things like meetups and forums and social media. And finally, I'd like to leave you with a discussion. You are encouraged to pause this video to answer these questions. The first question, what activist or activism roles speak to you the most? How would you like to do more for your social justice causes? What causes or movements do you focus on and why? Do you feel you need to better balance yourself with self-care and your activist work, along with being a student and all the other identity aspects? What holds you back from doing more activist work? And finally, are there any other additional resources you need to be successful in your work? And I'd like to leave you with a final thought. Ida B. Wells, journalist, activist, made a point to write about lynchings, violence against the Black community. She spoke out about public transportation segregation before Rosa Parks and the NAACP organized her protest. Wells had a first-class ticket. Upon trying to board the cab, she was denied and forcibly removed. And all the toxicity that social media can be, there is a power that can be leveraged. The device in your hand has a privilege of our kairos, our time, our era. It's the power of witnessing, recording, documenting, and shining light on aspects of our society that need to be changed. Thank you so much. I appreciate your time and attention.